It was just one of those nights in the city with those weirdly warm summer nights when the streets were lined up with people, energy, and music. Sandwiched right in the middle of it all was Caleb, the ultimate trust fund kid who had everything handed to him on a silver platter. He had been one of those individuals who liked to flash his cash, hold parties, and generally act as if everyone else was a background character in the movie of his life. Tonight he was in a rare form. While the city was filled with life and excitement, Caleb felt absolutely indestructible. For him, the world was his playground where nothing could touch him. He lived by the attention, envy, and whispers every time he walked by in designer clothes and flashy accessories. The whole of Caleb's life had just been one flowing long event where he was always the main character, and the rest just presented to cover his gaps. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight was going to spin out of his control and a whirlwind of crazy events in his life. Caleb had been out drinking, partying with his friends at one of the city's most exclusive nightclubs. His best friend James had been the responsible one, keeping an eye out on Caleb and making sure he didn't get into any trouble. James knew from his experience that when Caleb got too drunk, things could spiral out of control very quickly. He had witnessed this version of Caleb a whole lot more often than he would ever care to. The moment he drank enough booze that it could filter its way into Caleb's body, the silly trust fund baby was transformed into a much more volatile entity. It wasn't the drinks themselves that James had a problem with, but rather Caleb's confidence. The alcohol just fueled that sense of superiority, making him believe he was actually above the law as well as above everyone else. James knew that was going to go horribly wrong tonight. The party in Caleb's drunkenness just didn't seem to stop, only building his bravado with one more shot after another. When Caleb drank, he tended to become someone else as someone cocky, impulsive, invincible, or so he thought. James had tried to get him to slow down, but Caleb brushed him off with a smirk and a dismissive wave. He was untouchable. Nothing could ruin his night, or so he thought. Caleb laughed loud enough to be heard through the club, his voice booming louder with every drink. Everyone around him was a clear enabler, encouraging that kind of reckless behavior so long as it got them free drinks and an invitation to the next over-the-top shindig. No one could tell Caleb to quit. No one but James. And even James, the man who had known Caleb the longest, couldn't get through to him. Nothing was going to spoil his night, Caleb thought, or so he told James, who was growing increasingly worried. By the time the strobe lights of the club had flashed on, indicating the end of a very long night, Caleb was barely able to stand straight up. James knew he needed to get Caleb home. He knew exactly what was coming next and hoped that he could get them both out safely before things escalated further. That is when it happened. Caleb, noticing James take his car keys from his pocket, got that weary, mischievous look in his eyes, the one which always preceded bad news. The key moment was when Caleb's eye went to the keys. It fell at the bottom of James's chest, the heart sinking when he saw that looking that dangerous, impulse-driven look there. The look was one James had learned over time to loathe, a look he'd seen before his less riskier places than these. But this was different. This wasn't a fight over some stupid bar stunt or a stupid prank. It was a high-performance sports car. Caleb was hardly in shape, let alone think to drive. James was feeling the stress as he struggled to act fast. "Hey, let me drive," Caleb slurred, reaching for his keys. James froze. "No way, man, you're wasted. I'll drive us back." Caleb's smirk spread wider, that same arrogant grin he wore whenever he was nearly certain he could talk himself out of anything. "I can handle it," Caleb insisted, rocking slightly as he was leaning on the doorframe. But James wasn't buying it. The thing was, James knew Caleb too well and wasn't going to let him get behind the wheels this time. The thing was, Caleb was not in the habit of being denied, and that was all set to become yet worse news. But Caleb wasn't going to take no for an answer, especially in his drunk state. His smirk widened into a reckless grin. "Come on, it's my turn. You always drive. What's the worst could happen?" He knew Caleb wouldn't give up too easily. He'd try to make him see reason. But in Caleb's head, now the night had turned into a game and he wanted to win. In his head, it wasn't just the car, it was the power. Caleb always had to be on top of things, but tonight was no exception. The alcohol had blunted his reasoning to the point that even though the danger was head straight at him, he could not see it anymore. James knew where this was going to go, and once more firmly told him no was a no and began walking towards the car. It was then that Caleb snapped. All in an instant, all of his demeanor changed. No longer playful, Caleb lunged forward, snatching the keys out of James's hand with surprising speed for someone who's as drunk as him. It was always the unpredictability that scared James. Caleb grinned carefree 1 minute and reared up to attack the next minute. Caleb's sense of entitlement kicked in. How could James deny him anything he wanted? How could anyone? With alcohol and entitlement to fuel his desires, Caleb wasn't just going for the keys. He was taking the night by the throat, and James could do nothing to restrain him. "Caleb, don't!" James yelled, but it was too late. Caleb had just stumbled to the car already, which was a brand new sports car that James had saved up for years to buy. Before he could do anything to stop him, Caleb was seated in the driver's seat, fiddling with the ignition. The engine growled and started, and grinning across his face, Caleb hit the gas. James's ears had it that he was hearing the sound of death. It was this car, so many years of toil and savings and dreams all in one place in their prime, slipping away piece by piece from under Caleb's determined nostrils as he revved the engine with no care for the damage he did. Panicked and annoyed in equal measure, his heart pounding in his chest and his mind spinning wildly. He wanted to run after the car, try to catch him before he drove off, but it was too late. Caleb was disappearing into the night, speeding away. James froze in mid-stride, eyes wide in horror as his car reared into the night with Caleb behind the wheel. Panic then set in. He knew Caleb was not only drunk but also reckless, and that combination was a ticking time bomb. The pit in James's stomach grew as the taillights disappeared into the distance. He had witnessed Caleb make poor choices before, but this was different. This was dangerous. He stood motionless for what it felt like an eternity, deciding whether to chase him or call the police. Eventually, James came to realize that he had no other option. Caleb was a danger to himself and everyone else around the road. He grabbed his phone in a shaking hand and offering his last hopes that it wasn't too late. As Caleb tore down the street, his tires were screeching around every corner, and he had never felt so invincible to the dangers of the world. Meanwhile, James struggled to call the police. As he attempted to explain, his heart was racing within his chest. "My friend, he's drunk. He stole my car. Please, can you have him stopped before something terrible happens?" The police, of course, reassured James that they would alert him, but the knot in his stomach grew tighter. He knew Caleb knew that once on the road in the state, anything could happen. In his mind, he saw his worst fears. The streets were dangerous enough at night, and Caleb at the wheel, a disaster that was waiting to happen. James was frantic, filled with fear as the dispatcher tried to calm him down, repeating constantly with an increasing panic, "He's going to crash." Losing his car was the least of his worries. Losing Caleb was much worse. And there was always the possibility that Caleb could hurt someone else. Every second being an hour was how he had reason to feel helpless while waiting for the police to arrive as he paced the street. He had nothing but imagination of the happenings of this moment along the road. Caleb had hardly gone 3 blocks when things first started to go horribly wrong. In his drunk haze, street lights seemed to blur together and the road seemed to twist and turn. Yet Caleb pushed the car faster. The powerful engine responded to every reckless command, speeding through the intersections, barely avoiding pedestrians, running red lights, and as if they did not count. All stood vivid in his mind, Caleb whizzing through all those red lights, speeding through every intersection, just barely avoiding pedestrians. Each outcome flickered through his head at record speed, beating out his heart several measures of time. He kept glancing at his phone, waiting for that call, that update, anything. But he got nothing. And that nothingness was very loud. The world outside the car became blurry with lights and sounds. To Caleb, it was exhilarating. The rush of adrenaline pumped him up to the point where no cautionary feeling could be unleashed, but in reality, the swaying was extremely dangerous, getting from one side of the road to the other. Other cars honked angrily as Caleb barely skirted collision after collision. But he was too drunk to care. Too lost in the moment to realize just how close he was to disaster. Every red light he sped through was bringing him one step closer to the inevitable crash. Yet instantly, everything did an utter about-face. The road ahead began to curve upward, quite sharply, up near a construction zone. The street was filled with the warning signs and barricades, but to a drunk Caleb, they were just bright colors flashing in the dark. He didn't slow down. He didn't even think about it. And by the time he realized that the turn was too sharp, it was already too late. The tires screeched as the car tried to hug the curve, but its chances were too slim. Caleb had misjudged the whole road in his reckless state. It came up too fast for him to process, and before he could slam on the brakes, the car collided head-on with the barracks. The sound of metal crunching, glass shattering, and Caleb's scream filled the air in that single horrifying instant. Everything happened in the blink of an eye, and Caleb did not have time to react when the car flipped over and it crashed into another parked vehicle before skidding to a halt. The car hit the barricade at full speed, metal screeching against metal, and in one split second the world stood still. Caleb was weightless, hanging from time itself, the terrible realization coming too late. The car spun out of control, slamming into a parked vehicle with a deafening crash, flipping onto the side before it came to a stop. There was complete silence, it seemed, for an eternity after that. Smoke curled up from the wreckage, debris scattered across the street. The sports car that had been so pristine now lay crumpled in broken, twisted metal and shattered glass glinting under the streetlights. Caleb's mind was racing. He didn't know what had just occurred. He had a vague recollection of how he had gotten there, but could clearly see that the wreckage told its own story of the destruction around him. Sweat dripped from his brow as his heart pounded in his chest with an effort to unbuckle his seatbelt. Panic set in as he labored to free himself. It was no fender bender, it was a full-scale disaster, and there was no escape from it. The weight of his actions came crashing down on him like a ton of bricks, and for the first time that night, Caleb felt really helpless. Caleb lay still. Then, miraculously, he stirred. Groaning, he fumbled with his seatbelt, his head spinning from the crash and the alcohol coursing through his system. Dazed and confused, he crawled out of the wreckage, bleeding and bruised but alive. He then stumbled a few steps before collapsing onto the pavement, gasping for breath as his body finally gave into the shock. He tried to stand upright but couldn't, his legs quavering under him as he tried to balance himself back up. Blood slid down along his cheeks, carrying dirt and debris from the smashed wreckages with it. The world spun before his eyes and he fell onto the pavement, gasping for air and shot ragged breaths as his body steadied itself from the shock of the crash. So he survived, but it would not be for a period long after that when he could tolerate the feeling or remorse for what he had done. All he could feel at that time was complete revulsion and terror. Approaching sirens filled the cool night air, their wail growing louder by the second. Caleb's world, once a haze of reckless abandon, now came crashing down around him quite literally. The police showed up in a matter of minutes, and when they saw it, they couldn't believe their eyes. They'd been preparing for your run-of-the-mill DUI case, but this was far worse. It wasn't until the officers were right beside him that Caleb even acknowledged their presence. Countless thoughts swam in his head, still trying to put together what had just happened. The magnitude of his actions didn't hit him yet, but it was about to. "Stay down," one of the officers ordered, pinning him to the ground and handcuffing his wrists behind his back. Caleb offered no resistance. He couldn't. All that arrogance, cockiness, and the aura of invincibility had worn just hours before was gone in an instant. As the biting metal of handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, Caleb felt the final remnants of his invincible mask crumbling beneath his breath. He always genuinely believed that nothing really bad could ever happen to him. Money, status, and connections protected him from any effects of wrong actions on his part. But now, lying flat on the pavement with his hands tied in his back, Caleb realized no privileges was going to save him this time around. As the paramedics were taking him in, Caleb's drunken stupor was then transformed into a cold and sobering reality of just what exactly he had done. His friend's car destroyed, his freedom gone, and for what? A joyride filled by alcohol's ego. James had been desperately dialing Caleb's phone when he received the news from the police. His worst nightmare had just come true. The car had been wrecked to pieces. But some miracle happened and Caleb remained alive. A gush of relief ran through his body, only to be replaced with anger and a heartbeat. How could Caleb have been so irresponsible, so selfish? The slight noise, however, the actual call came as quiet as a shock. Instead of making James pick up the phone as he had expected, it set off such a whirlwind of anger within him that by the time Caleb was on the line, he began to spout off about how he is indeed alive and how everything is going to be okay. James's anger was boiling to the surface. How could his best friend, the man he trusted the most in the world, could have done something so reckless? James had always known that Caleb was careless, but this? Something he had never dreamt of. The car was gone, but more so his friendship was hanging by a thread. The next few days were a blur of court and press. The accident headlined the news: drunk spoiled brat destroys friend's car in reckless joyride. Caleb's family was influential and powerful, but trying to hush things up was futile since the damage was done. Caleb was looking at DUI charges, reckless driving, and property damage. For the first time in his life, his trust fund couldn't buy him out of anything. The court hearings were brutal. James, heartbroken and betrayed, testified against his former friend. The once strong friendship had been reduced to shambles on that night, the result of reckless stupidity. From the golden boy who could do no wrong, Caleb had now faced the full weight of his actions. It was a display for all to see on the last day at the courthouse, and reporters lined the steps, recording every second of Caleb's demise. Indoors, everything was not as well. Caleb was hunched over in a chair at the defense table, the confident diva demeanor destroyed. His family sat behind a picture of shock and defeat. They had never thought that their spoiled son would land them here, now before a judge preparing to give him the sentence so he rightfully deserved. James sat in the front bench trying to keep his cool. The scowl of him could curdle milk. That night he lost more than a car. He lost a friend. As the judge read Caleb's sentence, it was a closure he couldn't help but feel. Caleb got 6 months in jail, together with heavy fines and community service. It wasn't just about the punishment, but about Caleb finally facing the consequences of his actions. As police dragged Caleb away in handcuffs, all of the glitz and glamour were suddenly off his life. The boy who once seemed so unreachable was finally paying the ultimate price for those wild choices. As for James, he went his separate way, but he was never able to get over the betrayal. He learned one painful lesson that night. Some people, no matter how close you think they are to you, will look out for number one no matter what. That friendship could never be recovered, but at the end of it all, James knew one thing. He'd never let himself get taken advantage of again. Do you think the punishment was enough for what Caleb did? Let us know in the comments below. Like this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to make sure you never miss on our next story. Thanks for watching, and remember, no matter who you are, every decision has consequences. Want to know why the cop arrested this creepy stepdad? Check out this video to find out.